Hello. I hope you're having a very good start into the ECREA summer/winter school, and that you will be enjoying very interesting conversations, that you will get good questions and comments regarding the work that you're doing, that you will share thoughtful ideas with your colleagues, and that several of these lectures and the papers that you will be discussing will be of interest to what you're doing. My name is Asko Lehmuskallio. I work at Tampere University in the New Social Research Program, as well as at the Communication Sciences Unit at the Faculty of Information Technology and Communication. My background is in cultural anthropology and in media studies, and I've been for quite a while very interested in questions relating to the visual. So Andros Sivak asked me to talk about some of my recent work, and I decided I'd share with you a talk based on a piece called "The Camera as a Meeting Place for Decision Making," which tries somehow to reconfigure how we might think about what a camera is. So increasingly today, imaging has become ubiquitous. We see not just professionals or semi-professionals using visual materials, but more or less, so to say, almost everyone. Obviously, there are exceptions, but a wide range of people have started to use images in their personal communication, in dealing with public officials, with different kinds of companies. And it's not seldom to find non-professionals taking hundreds or even thousands of photos each month. Somewhat surprisingly, if we think about this societal development, in many fields of study, images tend to be still taken for granted. We still hear these kinds of ideas that a picture is worth 1,000 words, that they could be understood transnationally, providing a universal language which we don't have to learn. My aim is to show that images are actually more complex, and that in order to be used at all, they have to fit particular social practices and aims. As images, they are seldom reducible to one interpretation only, and their polysemy regularly produces problem. That is, they can be interpreted in various ways. That's one of the features of quite a few images. Whereas many visual researchers have long focused mainly on particular kinds of images, for example, for photography, such as Cartier-Bresson's Decisive Moment, or specific authors, for example, the work of Eugene Adjet, Man Ray, or Nan Goldin, to name a few. My suggestion is to focus on both practices of symbolization, that is, the ways in which we provide meaning with the help of images, as well as on material mediations within images in order to get a grasp of contemporary visual cultures. With material mediations, I refer to the importance of the technical infrastructures, the ways in which things, in a way, strike back in the ways in which we try to provide meaning using communicational means. In my own work, I'm particularly fascinated by photography, its various developments throughout history until today, including future visions that various developers have. In recent years, I've specifically focused on developments which have been integral for photography to have become what is called ubiquitous. Examples of this research include a focus on the early use of Kodak, the early use of mobile camera phones such as Nokia, as well as the history of the passport, including the use of photos therein. And what's been especially exciting about this line of work is not just the way in which it's been very interesting research-wise and within academic circles, but it's been taken up by societal stakeholders. So I've been involved in co-curating an exhibition called #Snapshot at the Finnish Museum of Photography already quite a few years back, and which was also shown at the Triennale of Photography in Hamburg. And here's an edited collection, which we made in relation to that exhibition. And this year, we had the chance to make an exhibition together with Paula Hara and with colleagues from the Finnish Museum of Photography on material that we had collected on the history of the Finnish passport. And there's a book that came out of that work. So that's one of the aspects that I hope you will find also interesting in your work. You might be working with very different kinds of social and societal stakeholders, not exhibitions at all, but maybe with TV shows or with magazines or particular kinds of online platforms, in order to also have this possibility for social impact, social interaction with other stakeholders than only academic stakeholders, although the academic part I find is especially pleasing and interesting. One of the motivations for my work is understanding the repeated social contestations that emerge as novel camera technologies are introduced. Already in the 19th century, the use of carry-on cameras was lamented to be eroding privacy and degenerating morale. And today, the use of facial recognition technology is heavily contested. For example, the journal Nature has published on beating biometric bias by highlighting the pitfalls of widespread use of facial recognition technology. And this visualization is from the piece published in Nature, where you see one of the major ways in which facial recognition technologies work. There are various different ones as well, but one of the ways is detecting a face, then noting landmarks, calculating the interrelations between different landmarks, creating a mask based on those calculations, which cannot be again applied to other kinds of images, or then used in order to rotate the mask and to render perhaps very novel kinds of images. And facial recognition technology tends to be used for identification, which is often used one-to-one comparison. So we have a database with images, and then we check if the face of someone already is within that database, and we can check, oh, that's the person. Or then one-to-many comparisons, when there's a way of not having a full database yet, but trying to search for possible matches. And then they're used for social sorting and classification, when particular features of the face are used in order to make claims about the person's gender, for example, or age, or morale, or sexual orientation, etc. And many of these are highly contested and especially problematic. So it's no wonder that there are increasing calls for regulating facial recognition technologies. And for example, in San Francisco, not that long ago, the public use, in public settings, the use of facial recognition technology has been banned, and quite a few other places have followed suit. And the problems which are often brought up deal with high error rates in identification, especially in the so-called wild, that is not in heavily standardized settings. These technologies tend to misidentify people of color, women, children, basically those people who have not been part of the development of these technologies and the training databases that are used for these facial recognition technologies. That is, already vulnerable people are at greater risk of being disenfranchised. The databases collected, again, may be used for identity thefts, as we have these biometric face prints, which are anchored digitally to other kind of information, which might be pivotal in order to make claims about your identity in the first place. The databases may be used in other ways abusively, for example, by spying on partners, business partners, on families, neighbors, etc. And the wide implementation of these technologies changes social dynamics in societies. Automated and ubiquitous monitoring of populations strengthens societal power asymmetries. Michel Foucault has written about the interrelation between power and knowledge that many of you might be aware of. And surveillance studies has again shown us that once surveillance technology is implemented, it tends to be used later for other kinds of purposes. So it's very seldom that surveillance technologies which are implemented are then taken away. Now, bearing these developments in mind, I'd like you to consider today the camera and how you understand what the camera is. And my suggestion is not to consider it mainly as a specific box-like device for taking photographs, but rather more broadly as a meeting place for decision making. In order to do so, we will first focus on the notion of focusing media, a particular concept developed by two anthropologists, then on becoming photographed and how the camera plays a role here, a different kind of a role, so that we may start to unravel the notion of the camera itself. I suggest that this reframing of the camera is useful for underscoring the importance of the decisions that we take regarding how those cameras work, influencing the ways in which we live together. This is ever more important as our social interactions are increasingly mediated by information and communication technologies, a trend which has been accelerating due to the measures taken to curb the COVID-19 pandemic. Various scholars who focus on visual practices have usefully stressed the role of an education and training in seeing for gaining ability to orient oneself well in one's immediate environment, with or without technical assistance. So noting that seeing itself is not something we inherently have within us, but we need to painstakingly learn it while we grow up or are within particular kinds of educational settings, for example. Seeing appropriately, seeing correctly, knowing what a good image is, for example, necessitates particular sets of skills which we gain painstakingly while working against the resistances of the everyday. This enskillment constitutes, first and foremost, attunement between the perceptual system of a specific actor and the kinds of situated environments that this actor has learned to act. Now, this might seem complicated, but I'm sure you'll understand it quickly. So, Tim Ingold, who's an anthropologist working on perception, has discussed how hunters, whom he has been studying, have learned to attune themselves to particular kinds of environment. And he has suggested that the perceptual system of the hunter is attuned to picking up information critical to the practical conduct of his hunting, to which the unskilled observer simply fails to attend. So in situations, if you are not a hunter who has learned to read particular kinds of traces within the environment, you will not be able to do so because you need to be educated in how to do so. That information is not in the mind. It's not something which is mainly stored within your brain, for example, but it's in the world. And its significance lies in the relational context of the hunter's engagement with the constituents of that world. And what he's trying to say here is that when people, in his case hunters, get within specific kinds of environments in order to do a particular task, the hunting that they are doing, they start to notice particular aspects of the environments which they will know are important for hunting itself. And they might have difficulties in explaining later on all of the aspects which were important for their hunt, although obviously they will have some of that knowledge stored directly so that they can start to talk about it. A person using photographic technologies rather than a pair of arrows does something similar, which is based on the skills learned in doing so. And Eve Forrest has written a very nice piece on the concept of noticing in regard to photography, the importance of developing the skill of noticing. Photographic technologies are usually not used for their own sake, but as a means of, for example, obtaining a photo for a passport to enable travel to another country, or for being able to identify and verify speeding in traffic so that the perpetrator will not choose to exceed speed limits later. Or we can think about people using images for online dating sites, for example, in order to attract potential future intimate partners. So the images play a particular kind of a role within specific kinds of actions. The particular cameras used for creating photographic images are used to guide attention and perceptual attunement within specific practices. They act as focusing media. They focus the action, the way in which the action is lived out. Not to be understood only in a physical sense, but also as a way of guiding epistemological interests in the here and now. That is, the interests that direct the particular action in that moment. As Grasseni and Gieser, two anthropologists who have coined the term, point out, focusing media are so central that much of the learning and enskillment processes revolve around them. It is with them that the powers of reconfiguration and transformation become most apparent. The act of photography includes a range of artifacts that we use for taking images, but of particular concern is the camera, especially as it has become embedded into a variety of devices used for very different kinds of purposes, as we've seen with some of the early examples. So what kinds of devices were used for early portraiture, acting as focusing media guiding epistemological interests? In 1840, it took 6 minutes of exposure time by John William Draper and careful preparation of his sister face for creation of what the Eastman Kodak Company later presented in an advertisement from 1919, which you see in the slide, as the first camera portrait. Later research has shown that this is not actually the first camera portrait, but that's not so important for the point. The text of the advertisement tells us of the practical arrangements necessary. To ensure the best possible lighting, Professor Draper's sister chalked her face and in the glaring sunshine posed for him on the roof of the old University of the City of New York in Washington Square. These requirements for exposing a portrait photograph are telling. They speak to the careful orchestration needed for this endeavor. In a schematic drawing adjacent to the photo reproduced, so here's again the advertisement and here's the schematic drawing. Professor Draper is shown standing behind the camera, leaning slightly forward. The camera sits on a table and a box with bottles is on the right-hand side, with the professor holding one bottle in his right hand. The subject, his sister, poses in front of a mounted backdrop, which was clearly prepared in advance, and, as we've been made aware, she not only holds a pose, but has also applied chalk to her face for the best possible result. So there's a multiplicity of attunement necessary in order to create this image in the first place. Draper needed exceptional conditions to craft the portrait photo of his sister. Blazing sunlight, a white enough surface, a mobile camera obscura that could be kept perfectly still at a suitable height, and the necessary chemicals readily at hand, along with all the requisite knowledge and skills for using these in the correct manner, the right order, and with the correct timing for each. An additional requirement was that his sister, acting as the model for the camera portrait, had learned and perfected standing still without moving her head for the entire duration of exposure for 6 minutes, as we've been made aware. She also needed to allow her face to be chalked white without protesting this masquerade, thus anticipating a white face bias in later photographic technologies, which is especially now discussed in relation to the biometric bias in facial recognition technologies. To be depicted at all, she had to act and behave in very medium-specific ways. The camera as a focusing medium called for the photographer, Draper, to attune himself to a variety of artifacts and devices which needed to be handled with care, such that an image of a human body could be transferred to another medium by optical and chemical means, away from the body. Here, the wooden box, usually identified as a camera, is only one part of an extensive assemblage of skills, bodies, items, and environmental conditions necessary for performing photography. While Draper's skills were certainly a melange of proficiencies of the body, knowledge in use, and an ability to follow instructions set out by others, photography became quickly and early on entwined with various kinds of suggestions and experimentation related to how one might best carry out photography. The guidelines and their presentation differed greatly with the kinds of interests and motivations associated with photography. In a contrast against embodied, lived experience in here and now conditions, photographic cameras afforded what is called time-axis manipulation, a sort of slice or cutting from the mediated everyday. The act of photographically cutting was, again, premised on the ways in which cameras and their possible uses were understood at the time. As Sarah Kember and Jana Zielinska have suggested, photography may be understood, and I quote, as an active practice of cutting through the flow of mediation, where the cut operates on a number of levels: perceptive, material, technical, and conceptual. For example, Francis Galton, a famous statistician, a person advocating for eugenics, for example, and someone very much into the development of forensics, he posited that specific kinds of cuts suggested that photography allowed him to see beyond single instances and to reveal types that remain invisible to the technically unaided eye. And his idea of these kinds of types was as problematic as the ideas he tried to provide, especially in regard to eugenics. His interest in photography had less to do with the immediately visible than with hidden features that he believed could be rendered visible via technical images. Galton suggested that his composite photos created from several separate portraits gave visualization to what he called pictorial statistics. And he wrote, they would be suitable to give us generic pictures of man, such as Quetelet obtained and outlined by the ordinary numerical methods of statistics, as described in his work on anthropometry. And as some of you will know, Quetelet was fundamental in the creation of the idea of a norm of a particular individual within society, which is basically virtuality, a kind of a fiction which doesn't exist, but is calculated with the help of statistical methods and has become a very important way of governing societies since the early 19th century. The composite portraits Galton created were considered to render visible a novel scientific method of creating both research data, the specimen, and a visualization thereof. Galton continues thus on the same page. I quote, by the process of composites, we obtain a picture and not a mere outline. It is blurred, something like a damp sketch, and the breadth of the blur measures the variability of individuals from the central typical form. And here in the image, you'll see an example from a book on reasoned and unreasoned images, which discusses, as one of the photographers, Galton, and you'll see one of the areas in the face which is marked. It's not marked by Galton, but by the author of the book, Josh Ellenbogen. And he notes how it was important for the ideas of Galton that there was a visualization of the information in image form. And he thought that the statistical calculations, which were usually shown in very different ways, and we're used to seeing them in different ways, except when we think about information visualizations, they could be seen within the images themselves. And the blur itself indicated if the data collection had been correct. So depending on the kind of blur produced at the outlines of the faces of those composite portraits. So basically, you had an arrangement, as shown here in one of Galton's publications, where he collected images, often from very different kinds of people, sent to him, and he copied them into a particular kind of standardized form, which were then taken one after the other on one single plate to create these kinds of composite portraits. And he thought and claimed that these generic images were able to tell how particular groups of people looked like, how they were, thus basically socially sorting individuals. The actual images from Galton's 19th century statistical photography show how he tried to accord these a mark of scientific authority, derived on one hand from his how-to specifications for pictorial statistics, so having very elaborate ideas of how these images should be exactly created and how the image specimens should be collected in the first place, but also partly from visual styles prevalent at the time, such as what has become called the Victorian blur. And the blur at the time in 19th century has been claimed to be one way of visually creating the idea of authenticity. And we'll see in these images, for example, in Draper's image of the sister, also the importance of blur, which obviously partially came from long exposure times. But there was an interrelation, not only in photography, but also in painting, of the notions of veracity, authenticity, and blur at the time. The composites were made with an intention to portray the social in a particular rendering of the face that was understood as a photographic aggregate of its components. Now, while this kind of technologically mediated and thereby naturalized social sorting has since been called clearly into question and problematized adequately, composite portraits continue to be created regularly for numerous purposes, whether to show the new face of America, attempting to identify criminals by means of photographic portraits, or for striving to assess features such as the assumed sexual orientation of those depicted. Novel uses of composites continue on the path paved by Galton's early work, and many bear striking visual similarities to their historical antecedents, which tend to remain little discussed. So if you have an interest, for example, in the uses of current facial recognition technologies, it's interesting to see how a particular subset especially focuses on and shows particular kinds of visualizations which bear striking similarities to these 19th century images. Importantly for Galton, as well as for later work with computational technologies in a similar way, the formal procedure of how to do has remained important for making truth claims. Nowadays, they're called computer algorithms, which clearly indicate how particular aspects should be calculated in order for us to believe in them. The camera, in this case of a very different sort than that used by Draper, guides perception and suggests novel foci with visual means. Now, if one is to disentangle some of the variance and variety of photography, I think it is useful to consider the attunement between human bodies and different kinds of photographic devices. Within this interrelation, or these interrelations, the camera plays an integral role, reconfiguring and transforming how bodies and devices interact. If the camera indeed is a focusing medium which plays its part in how we detect, recognize, and socially sort one another, a focus on the forms and uses of photographs shows important variation in how the camera stores images in such a manner that these can indeed be, again, transmitted across space and time, then sent on to another point in space and time in order for these images to act as mediators in doing things. Now, the etymology of the word camera assists us in disentangling the everyday roles played by cameras and how they may be considered to have agency. As the cases of Draper's portrait and Galton's composite images demonstrate, the camera as a device for taking photos is only one part of a much larger whole, and a part whose role changes in use. Draper needed to choreograph the photographic act in situ, in the moment, holding and using the variety of photographic devices at hand, while Galton used pre-existing images, photos already taken, developed and printed, as a source for his generic images, thereby exercising greater control of how the claimed invisible qualities were made visible. Today's cameras, as those discussed in Nature's article on biometric bias, are again more complex, automating algorithmically the ways in which humans are detected, recognized, and classified with the help of camera technologies. Cameras take manifold forms and are used in a wide range of settings, and their agency on photographic processes cannot be disentangled by merely studying the resulting images. Interestingly, when going through Oxford English Dictionary's definition of the concept camera, it is only when one reaches item 4b, which you'll see here, that one finds the device for taking photographs sense, referring to a general understanding of cameras that often remains unquestioned in discussions of photography. In contrast, and fitting quite well with my suggestion of considering the camera as a crucial focusing medium for photography, meanings higher in the list include the specific setting, the department of the papal curia dealing with finance, and, after that, the more general definition, a chamber in which a deliberative, judicial, or legislative body meets. Accordingly, in addressing the diverse sets of uses within which photographic devices are situated and how they are momentarily assembled, the camera as a focusing medium is most usefully understood precisely as a kind of setting that is used for purposes of deciding upon elemental aspects of the everyday. Who is allowed to enter and who is not? Who will be questioned further and who may pass immediately? Last but by no means least, on what matters is our focus of attention set? To what are we attuned? Contemplating the camera as a focusing medium helps us pay attention to the particular ways in which the process wherein photos are taken, processed, and rendered visible influences the images we actually get to see. Many scholars, as Amy Cox Hall notes in the introduction to the volume The Camera as Actor, have taken little interest in the ways in which a camera influences and shapes precisely what is constituted in its form, even though the history of photography exhibits an astonishing variety of images, devices, and other kinds of uses. Here, I've tried to add to related discussions on photography and the role of the camera by suggesting a broader understanding of a camera as a chamber in which a deliberative, judicial, or legislative body meets. With the camera understood as a meeting place for decision-making, it becomes clear that some of the decisions made within these chambers may have been delegated to technical artifacts, prescribed to work according to defined sets of operations, and automated in ways that a human operator is only at times needed in the loop. When understood in this way, the camera, even in the driest empirical settings, is revealed to be much messier than neat models and formalizations may imply, and its effectiveness may be renegotiated, questioned, or, as often happens, taken at face value. But most importantly, if cameras are to act, they must be taken care of and worked for, and they must be believed to produce useful results. Otherwise, why would we invest such vast amounts of energy, effort, and time for them to produce images amongst us? The question we need to ask ourselves is, perhaps, what kinds of decisions do we delegate to which kinds of cameras and why? Thank you for your attention. You'll find some of these thoughts in extended form in this book chapter. And for more work on visual studies, especially at Tampere University, you may be interested in looking at the site of the Visual Studies Lab, where we have a range of different kinds of projects focusing on questions of the visual. I hope you will have a very exciting and interesting week with you, and that this summer/winter school will provide to be useful for your studies and for your work. All the best, and I'm looking forward to learning more about your work.